temptation, one which, you'll not be surprised to hear, is articulated, as is almost everything that we're thinking about in this course, in one of the two great founding narratives of the Western literary tradition, in this case, Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus, pictured here in elegant white tunic, is trying to get home from the Trojan War. He's trying to get back to his wife, who is waiting faithfully for him at home, and it's taking him about 20 years to do so. And along the way, as he tries to go home, he faces all sorts of temptations which threaten to divert him from his path. And the temptation that he faces in this picture, illustrated here in the form of these beautiful flying women, who look to me a little bit like Dementors from Harry Potter. He, however, finds them enormously tempting and is trying to figure out how to get the ship past the sirens, whose songs threaten to cause the ship to founder upon the shoal so that he can get home to Penelope. And what he comes up with are two different strategies. The first strategy he applies to his sailors. You will see that around the ears of each of them is cotton batting. He blocks their ears so that the apparent utility of the sirens is reduced for them. Unable to hear their song, the sailors are able to continue rowing the boat past their source of temptation. What he does to himself, as you can see, is he has himself at point A on the Ainslie curve, lashed to the mast, because like Michelle's children and like Ainslie, he recognizes that when the siren's song is available to him directly, he will be in that B state where the smaller, sooner reward, like turning off your alarm clock or eating that cupcake, looms larger to him. So what Odysseus does is he ties himself to the mast. Even though the temptation of the reward is evident to him, he has rendered himself unable to act on that temptation. And there is a tradition in the contemporary decision theory literature to use this metaphor of Ulysses and the sirens, Odysseus and the sirens, depending which translation you use of the name, to think about strategies for self-regulation. And it turns out that it's helpful, I think, to think about these strategies as falling into three categories. If you're trying to get past a temptation that has the structure that we've been looking at in this class, a smaller, sooner reward that, because of temporal discounting, looms disproportionately large in your decision structure, one way to get around it is by means of external constraints. You can separate yourself from the ability to act on the temptation, right? You can turn off the internet on your computer. You can use one of those cell phone condoms. You can render yourself unable to act on the basis of that which is going to distract you from your path. You can put your alarm clock all the way across the room. You can take the cupcakes out of your house. You can put your credit card in a glass of water in the freezer. All of these are ways of separating yourself from the ability to act on the temptation. Or you can separate yourself from the appeal of the temptation in some way. You can reduce its subjective utility to you by, for example, blocking your ears. So you won't even notice that the temptation is there. So that's a way of externalizing responsibility for decision-making in this case. And it's an extraordinarily effective way of self-regulating. You are an agent in the world. The actions which you're going to perform are actions on the world. And separating yourself from the ability to perform those actions is one way to get around temptation. A second way to get around temptation, which we've discussed a lot in the last two classes, is by direct appeal to the spirited or appetitive parts of your soul. So you can manipulate incentive structures for yourself. You can make things, change the relative utilities of the various rewards. You can subject yourself to interpersonal pressures. Remember, we put the smiley faces on your computer so that the gaze of the eyes of others would help you stick to your tasks. Or you can cultivate habits, right? You can get spirit and appetite into line with reason by cultivating natural ways of responding to things. But the third way that you can get around temptations is the one which we haven't discussed yet, and that is by means of reason. And it is in this light that Nozick discusses the roles that principles can play in allowing us not to be incontinent. So Nozick points out quite generally that what principles do is they group actions by putting them under a general rubric so that linked actions are viewed or treated in the same way. If one takes on as a principle to be a vegetarian, then any act of eating meat is seen as a violation of that principle. Even if one thinks there are circumstances where eating meat might be the right thing to do, all things considered, what the principle does is to classify that act with other acts of eating meat so that the actions become symbolic of one another. Smoking a single cigarette isn't so bad, but smoking lots of cigarettes is. And one thing that a principle can do is to let you have any one instance stand as an example of all. Principles, says Nozick, constitute a way of binding ourselves to the mass not through external constraints like ropes, but through internal commitments to following their mandates.
Okay. So principles of constraining reason, constraints. I don't think so. Shaping, not constraining, right? Or maybe it is.
And he points out that principles are effective in a wide range of cases. Intellectually,
Let
if you have
me
the
pull up the transcript for this vid. I cannot follow this. Okay, so Nozick points out quite generally that what principles do is they group actions. Okay, you cannot see. Okay. Is that what they do is group actions by putting them under a general rubric. What's a rubric? So that actions are viewed or treated in the same way. Rubric. What's a rubric? Gotta adjust this mic. I can study like this. Sorry about that. But this is self-defined, right? Principle. Already under principle. Yeah. Writing a document, a set of instructional rules. So that linked actions are viewed or treated the same way. Okay. Okay. General rubric. Okay. Principles are constraints on reason. The same way the earplugs and whatever the ropes were constraints on Homer. I guess she's saying that.
idea that there's a principle that connects one set of facts to another,
Yeah,
then the principle can transmit probability or support. The old cases came out a particular way. Every time you observed a certain kind of causation, it had a particular structure. You identify a principle, and you're now in a position to make predictions about new cases. Interpersonally, they let you appear to be a reliable person. Your past actions were of a certain kind, right? Every time I said I would give you money, I gave you money. So you can conclude on that basis, I have a principle, repay my debts, and on that basis, you predict my future actions. It's in fact exactly because of that that I switched all the written exercises to Thursdays rather than having extensions on some of them. My thought was this: suppose I've given extensions on 2 of the essays from Tuesday to Thursday. I look unprincipled about the regulations for this course. How will I be in a position to enforce the course's requirements if I appear unprincipled?
Okay, so principles are constraints of, not exactly constraints of reason. They're constraints of a general set of instructions. Instructions? Is that it? No. Let me put some light music background so that I don't just doze off so that stun locking can become easier and I can waste more time. Yes. There he is. Okay. Classical. Let's go. No. No, 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 no. Good. Principles are constraints of reason or on reason? Transcript. Like ropes, but through internal commitments. Okay. So principles are okay. On action. Principles are constraints, right? Yeah, they are. So mosaic constitute a way of binding ourselves to the mast, not through external constraints, but through internal commitments. Okay. Are constraints of reason. Principles are constraints. Again, I'm at square one. So what do I do? Principles that connect one set of facts to other, but then principle can transmit probability or support. What? Okay, so principles employ reason and control action, right? Principles constrain act employ reason to act as constraints on action. Reason to act as constraints on action. No, this is not employee commitments as constraints on action. Okay, I need to mute. Sorry about the bell. I don't think you guys can hear it. The mic's not picking up. Yeah, maybe. Principles employ commitments of reason. Action. No. Principles. I'm getting stun locked.
Suppose I adopt a new principle, the Thursday due date, with respect to which I am unwavering. Introspect a minute. Strangely, that seems more authoritative than having most of them due on Tuesdays and some on Thursdays. Intrapersonally, conceptualizing oneself in terms of principles gives a kind of narrative continuity to one's life. My past self was the kind of person who would never do X. My past self is the kind of person who always does Y. Articulating it in terms of a principle lets me connect my future self to my past self. It gives me a sense of continuity over time. And finally, intrapersonally, principles provide ways of overcoming temptation. Ooh, every time I see a cupcake, I want to eat it. But if I have a principle that I don't eat dessert after 4 p.m., then it's easy. I don't have to make a decision on a case-by-case basis. The single act of eating that cupcake once, why that once? Why wouldn't I then do it all the time? Becomes a way of committing myself to future actions. Those of you who practice an instrument know that the easiest practice schedule is to practice every day. Because if you practice every day, there's no question of whether this is one of the days that you're going to practice. If you are committed to a certain kind of religious behavior, or a certain kind of dietary restriction, or a certain kind of exercise regimen, the easiest way to implement it is to say, always with respect to this domain, will I behave in those ways. And in fact, Nozick suggests that this is exactly the way to use principles to get past the Ainslie curve. The mark of a principle, he says, is that it ties the decision whether to do an immediate particular act to a whole class of actions of which the principle makes it part. The act now stands for the whole class. I discover that I'm overusing a particular kind of relaxational substance on weekends, and the most straightforward way for me to deal with that situation
every night.
Is to put a categorical restriction on my behavior.
Never.
Moreover, points out Nozick, I can make use of a really interesting irrationality about myself to fight irrationality with irrationality. Remember, I pointed out to you a few lectures ago that people who lose a $10 bill on the way to the theater are happy to buy a new ticket when they get there, but people who lose a $10 ticket on the way to the theater are unhappy to do so.
Yeah.
That's an instance of a general phenomenon known as sunk costs, that when we've invested a lot of effort in something, we're reluctant to stop acting on its basis, even if right then we don't prefer to do it anymore. And so
like
that's
what?
an instance where a few lectures ago, irrationality. Remember, I pointed out to you a few lectures ago that people who lose a $10 bill on the way to the theater are happy to buy a new ticket when they get there, but people who lose a $10 ticket on the way to the theater are unhappy to do so.
Yeah.
That's an instance of a general phenomenon known as sunk costs, that when we've invested a lot of effort in something, we're reluctant to stop acting on its basis, even if right then we don't prefer to do it anymore. And so Nozick suggests that if during A, that period leading up to the Ainslie curve, we invest many resources in the future pursuit of the larger reward, the fact that we tend not to ignore sunk costs provides us with a way to get past the temptation during the period B to choose the smaller sooner. If I decide I want to go to 6 plays a year and I buy 6 tickets, then even if it's raining on one of the nights that I was supposed to go, my tendency towards sunk costs will help me act on my action. All right, last 2 minutes, let me connect this to what we've done and where we're going. This, as you know, is the last lecture in the first unit of the course. We began this unit by reading Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational popular chapter, and we ended this unit by reading Ariely's Predictably Irrational popular chapter on procrastination. But unlike your experience on January 11th, you now have a philosophical framework in which to place his discussion. Unlike on January 11th, you now have a psychological...
Sunk cost fallacy, right? I haven't heard of it before. Let me ramble a bit. Sunk cost fallacy. So the people who are paying for tickets, if they lose the ticket, they're more hesitant when they get to the theater. They're more hesitant to buy the ticket. But if they lose like $10, they're not. Yeah, they can easily go into. So maybe they have to do some kind of an action, to compensate for their carelessness. Maybe that's why. It's not about cost or whatever. Okay. How? It's not about action or reason. It's about the effort. Yeah, it's a hassle that you have to buy a ticket again, right? Give me a second. Listen. No, don't listen. Let's just continue.
Framework in which to place this
Leave
discussion.
when
You've read Haidt,
this ends.
You've read Batson, you've read the dual processing work, you've read Milgram,
we have read everything.
and you've read his own scientific presentation of the case, and you've thought about the connections between them. What comes next? What comes next is a chance in your 5th and 6th directed exercises to address 3 psychology articles, which you yourself are going to choose and summarize and then come up with an experiment on the basis of. What comes next is a chance to think about the philosophical framework by writing your first and second essays. And what comes at the end of the course, and I'll preview it now, is a chance to think about the connections between them in the context of your final directed
I'm gonna
exercise,
LibriVox
which is
that
going to be to design
Aristotle
a week
books
of
and
the
whatever.
course yourself,
Whatever's
in which you choose
public
texts that you
domain,
think
I'll just
multiply
LibriVox it,
illuminate
all
the
of it,
topic.
and
So
stream it,
next lecture,
so that I
we'll
can
move
actually
on
pay
to our
attention to
discussion
it.
of morality,
Somewhat
and I'll
of an
connect it back
attention
to
to
some
it.
of the issues we've been talking about so far, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday, and especially to giving away the $6 to the very rational student who was lucky enough to earn it.
Take the $5.
Certain kind
Wait for
of
the 6.
coordination.
Yeah, I watched a bit.
So what I
No,
want
don't so. Just stay there.
to do
Smile.
in today's lecture is
Smile. Give me a good smile. Good smile. Good smile. No smiling. Okay, she's smiling.
so those will come in the middle of the lecture. Right in this lecture, I have 6 polling slides. So those will come in
Nice.
the middle of the lecture, right when all of you are zoning out because you got 2 hours of sleep last night. So even if you don't pay attention for the first,
Okay. I'll be right back. I'll give you some music so that you don't freak out. Even if there's like no one watching, still music. Might as well.
You say I make you nervous, a tragedy, I'm a beautiful disaster.
Be back.
A reckoning, you wonder how I got this way. You think I'm someone to be saved, someone to clean up and tame. Oh, some things never change, never change. Oh. You think I would look pretty on your arm once you cover up my bruises and battle scars, but it always ends the same. Can't bear the things I've had to face, got you crying on your knees in pain. Oh, some things never change, never change. Oh, you break your back to make me feel again, suffocate to make me breathe again, lose your mind from endless pain. Some things never change, never change. Oh, redemption never came. I stopped asking for forgiveness, cause you should know only fools tread where the angels fear to go, but you keep trying to get too close. Save myself by turning into stone, so save your judgment cause you just don't know. But some things never change, never change. Oh, they say I should feel guilty and change my ways, leaving crumpled bodies in my wake. Swear I didn't mean to make them break, swear I didn't mean to make them break. But they're so delicate and so mundane, and they keep coming like a moth to a flame. Oh, some things never change, never change. You break your back to make me feel again,
Oh, the song.
suffocate to make me breathe again.
part, you'll get
Whatever.
a quote in the middle. All right, so what is it that moral philosophy sets out to do? What is it to provide a philosophical account of morality? What moral philosophy is the systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and to justify moral principles and theories. That is,
Yeah, I
moral
get it.
philosophy, even if it ends up giving a non-systematic answer to how it is that morality works and what it is that morality does so within the endeavor of thinking systematically about the nature of morality. What do I mean by morality? I mean that moral theories aim to provide
Let me
accounts
boost your
of terms
just
like
a bit.
right and wrong, permissible and impermissible, ought and ought not, forbidden, good, bad, and the like. And
Let me
to
lower
provide
the
an
speed.
account of the behaviors
that?
to which those terms philosophy is
Let me
the
go back.
systematic endeavor
Let me
to
open the
understand moral
transcript.
concepts and to justify
Yes.
moral principles and theories. That is, moral philosophy even if it ends up giving a non-systematic answer to how it is that morality works and what it is that morality does so within the endeavor of thinking systematically about the nature of morality.
Okay.
What do I mean? The
Let's
Western
begin
tradition.
this from the start.
And then in the remaining sessions,
Okay, let's start from the
so
beginning.
what I
I'm-
want to do in today's lecture is
Nice.
to shift
Tell
gears
me.
somewhat from what we've been talking about in the first unit of the course. As you know, the
Okay.
first unit of the course was focused on a set of texts that were concerned with what is involved in human flourishing. And though our opening text, the Glaucon's Challenge from Plato's Republic, concerned itself with morality and the way in which morality contributes to human flourishing, we haven't up until this point given much attention to what philosophers have had to say about the nature of morality. And so the goal in this unit is, in an incredibly accelerated fashion, to introduce you today and next Tuesday to two of the most prominent moral theories in the Western tradition. And then in the remaining sessions before March break, to talk to you about some of the empirical research about these questions. And I know we have a wide range of backgrounds in this class. Some of you are now taking your
my
first
God,
philosophy
mosquitoes are getting
course.
in.
Some of you have taken an entire course on ethics. And so I've tried to pitch the lecture in such a way that it brings everybody up to speed, but that it does so in a way that I hope won't bore those of you who have encountered this before. In particular, to make up for the fact that there's very little empirical psychology in this lecture, I have 6 polling slides. So those will come in the middle of the lecture, right when all of you are zoning
Nice.
out because you got 2 hours of sleep last night. So even if you don't pay attention for the first part, you'll get to vote in the middle. All right, so what is it that moral philosophy sets out to do? What is it to provide a philosophical account of morality? What moral philosophy is the systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and to justify moral principles and theories. That is, moral philosophy, even if it ends up giving a non-systematic answer to how it is that morality works, that is, moral
Very
to
good
justify the systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and to justify moral principles and theories.
Okay.
That is, moral philosophy, moral endeavor to understand moral concepts and to justify moral endeavor. What moral philosophy is
systematic endeavor to understand moral concepts and justify moral principles. So it's like, oh my God, this is circular logic, right? It's like, yeah, this is circular logic, right?
moral principles and theories. That
I'm
is,
just gonna
moral philosophy,
stop.
even if it ends up giving a non-systematic answer to how it is that morality works and what it is that morality does so within the endeavor of thinking systematically about the nature of morality. What do I mean by morality? I mean that moral theories aim to provide accounts of terms like right and wrong, permissible and impermissible, ought and ought not, forbidden, good, bad, and the like, and to provide an account of the behaviors to which those terms apply. It is fundamentally, to remind you of a terminological distinction that we've made before, a normative as opposed to a descriptive enterprise. Philosophical moral theory doesn't aim to tell us how people act. It aims to tell us how people ought to act if they wish to conform to the constraints that morality places on them. In particular, moral philosophy is concerned with providing a principled answer to 3 kinds of questions. The first kind of question we encountered already in the context of Glaucon's challenge. It's the question of moral motivation. Why should we want to act in keeping with what morality demands of us? And in a minute, I'll give you a sense of the range of answers that have been provided to that question. So the first question that moral philosophy asks is, why would we even want to be moral? It then asks the particular question, what should we do insofar as we seek to act morally? And about that, we've had very little to say so far. We know that, according to Aristotle, to be brave, one acts as the brave one does. But Aristotle don't act morally. What should we do insofar as we seek to act morally? And about that, we've had very little to say so far. We know that, according to Aristotle, to be brave, one acts as the brave one does. But Aristotle just put forth bravery as a virtue without any explanation of what it was that made bravery fall into the category of virtues and cowardice fall into the category of vices, other than the very general analysis of the mean. And we haven't looked at any specific claims about particular actions being morally acceptable or not. So the second sort of thing that a moral theory tries to do, and again, I'll give some examples in a minute, is give us specific answers to the question, is this act morally okay?
Okay.
In addition, what a moral theory aims to do is to tell us why we gave the answers that we did in question 2. In virtue of what common feature are the acts that fall into the category of moral to be distinguished from the acts that fall into the category of immoral?
Okay.
So what do answers to these 3 questions look like? Let's start, since we've encountered it already, with the question of moral motivation. So one category of answers that one might give to why it is that we would be moral, act in keeping with the constraints of morality, is a self-interest account. So one might give an account which says, when you behave morally, things run smoothly. As Socrates argues in response to Glaucon, when you behave in keeping with the constraints of morality, there is harmony in your soul, and that provides you with the possibility of a certain kind of flourishing. Or you might have what's implicit in the very first argument that Glaucon gives, a view that morality provides a certain kind of stability in society. Each of us behaving in pro-social ways increases the likelihood of others around us behaving in pro-social ways. And so we reach a kind of equilibrium state whereby things run smoothly if everybody behaves pro-socially. And we'll talk about that again at the beginning of the political philosophy section. So one kind of self-interest theory is a theory that appeals to a certain kind of coordination, either a coordination among the parts of the soul or a coordination across individuals in a society. A second kind of self-interest theory is what we might call a get-good-stuff theory. So this lies at the heart of some religious traditions. Here's what you get if you act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal life in a really nice place.
Nice.
Here's what you get if you don't act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal continuation in a really unpleasant place. So the notion that there is some reward beyond earth for behaving in moral ways is an example of a self-interested justification of morality. Or one might give the sort of justification that Adeimantus gives in response to Glaucon's challenge. Adeimantus points out that one of the things morality provides you with is enhanced reputation. So as a result of behavior,
she's making a lot of points.
Philosophy section. So one kind of self-interest theory is a theory that appeals to a certain kind of coordination, either a coordination among the parts of the soul or a coordination across individuals in a society. A second kind of self-interest theory is what we might call a get-good-stuff theory. So this lies at the heart of some religious traditions. Here's what you get if you act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal life in a really nice place. Here's what you get if you don't act in keeping with the constraints of morality. You get eternal continuation in a really unpleasant place. So the notion that there is some reward beyond earth for behaving in moral ways is an example of a self-interested justification of morality. Or one might give the sort of justification that Adeimantus gives in response to Glaucon's challenge. Adeimantus points out that one of the things morality provides you with is enhanced reputation. So as a result of behaving in keeping with the standards of morality, you come to be perceived as having behaved in that way, and that reputation brings to you some value. Or it might be, as Aristotle discusses at the end of Book 10, that society is structured in some way that motivates people to act in keeping with the constraints of morality because doing so is a way of avoiding punishment. Many of us obey speeding laws for precisely that reason. We obey them most especially when there are flashing lights in our vicinity. But we can have an internalized version of the reduction of punishment as well. Part of the Freudian picture that we heard about in the Divided Soul lecture discussed the development of conscience as an internalization of external rules, whereby the superego gets upset when the id behaves in ways that aren't in keeping with the constraints of morality. And one can have a non-Freudian version of that as well that appeals to the notion of conscience. So the idea that what morality brings you is either the possibility of salvation or enhanced reputation, or the possibility of not being punished by external laws, or the possibility of not being punished by one's conscience, is another version of a self-interest theory. So that's one kind of justification one might provide for behaving in moral ways. A second, very different kind of justification says the reason we act morally is because normative features are fundamental features of the world. There's a brute ought out there. It's a fact about reality that what we are morally obliged to do is to act in whatever ways it is that morality demands, and not out of self-interest, but simply because we are responsive to that feature of the world, we are motivated to act morally. A third kind of justification, third kind of explanation of moral motivation, is what we might call a factive theory, that says roughly, this is just the way people are. So evolutionary...
Being moral is normal. That's the entire... Let me wind up with that.
Are responsive to that feature of the world. And it's a fact about reality that what we are morally obliged to do is to act in whatever ways it is that morality demands, and not out of self-interest, but simply because we are responsive to that feature of the world, we are motivated to act.
Wait.
What we are morally obliged to do is to act in whatever, but simply because we are responsive to there's a brute and says the reason we act morally is because normative features are fundamental features of the world about reality, whatever ways it is that morality demands, and not out of self-interest, but simply because we are responsive to that feature of the world, we are motivated to act morally. A third kind of justification, third kind of explanation of moral motivation, is what we might call a factive theory, that says roughly, this is just the way people are. So evolutionary accounts that say we've been selected, pro-social behaviors have been selected for, perhaps because they enable the resolution of coordination problems, but whatever the explanation, pro-social behaviors, says this theory, have been selected for. So it's a brute fact about the world that we behave in pro-social ways, not a brute normative fact about the world, just a brute descriptive fact about the world that we behave in that way. Or you might have not an evolutionary-based version of this, but a version that says, look, this is just the way the human soul expresses itself when it conforms to its natural state. So you might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is out of self-interest. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is because of altruism. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is just that's the way we do behave.
Okay.
Or you might have...
Let me see the summaries.
Behave morally. So you might have a theory of morality that says the reason the soul expresses itself when it conforms to its natural state.
Yeah, I do not know.
You might
what
have a
that
theory
means.
of morality that says the reason to behave morally is out of self-interest. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is because of altruism.
Because the reason to behave morally is because of self-interest. Okay. Being moral is chill. If everyone is moral, everyone is chill.
You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is just that's the way we do behave. Or you might have some sort of combination theory. And we've talked already about the first of these.
Then what were the descriptions?
You have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is out of self-interest. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is because of altruism. You might have a theory of morality that says the reason to behave morally is just that's the way we do behave.
Okay. So, the reason self-interest, let me note this down. Then
Morality that says the reason to behave morally is because of altruism. You might have a theory of
Altruism.
morality.
just cause. Just. Okay. This is like this condenses my list down to be moral because. So all of this harmony and other bullshit, I should cut it out, right? Because these are old arguments. Why can't she just give me the slides? I'm just gonna. Okay. Whatever. Just place use. Bro. Yes. Okay. Be moral because self-interest, altruism, just because. Self-interest. Okay. Self-interest. Okay, that makes sense. Altruism. Altruism. Does God fall under altruism? Because. Okay. I need to. Yeah, I know what I need to do. Self-interest. Altruism. Does God fall under altruism? He doesn't, right? Because it's punishment. I'm punishing you, that's why. So it's not punishment. To avoid getting burned and both by others. What does altruism even mean, bro? Am I just wrong? Disinterest or selfless concern for the well-being of others. Okay. But this is not selfless. This is not selfless. This is not selfless. This is not selfless. This is selfless. And so the altruism argument is the weakest one? Interesting. There's no way that the altruism argument is the weakest one, right? Maybe self-interest is like... So all of these fall under self-interest just because... Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. 4.1.1. The world is chill. Control X. Let's go. Enter 4.1.1.2. Control V. God. Cloud. Control X. All of these fall under 4.1.1.3. Okay. I think we're done. Right? Right? I think so. Okay. So this is just the next slide. Give me space. Give me some space. God, love, altruism. Control X. Just because I have to stop indexing, I'll just write down what she says and index it later because that's a better way. She goes back and forth in such ways that it becomes hard, you know. It's hard. It's hard to keep up with her because she goes 2000 years ahead to a study, then back to Aristotle, then back to this, then back to that. It's weird. I cannot believe altruism has the weakest argument for morality. There's no way, right? I'm probably stupid. That's why.
That says the reason to behave morally is just that's the way we do behave. Or you might have some sort of combination theory. And we've talked already about the first of these, the self-interest theory. And as this section of the course goes on, we'll talk more about some of the other sorts of explanation. So those are some examples of the kinds of answers that are given to the first question, the question of moral motivation. What kinds of issues arise when we think about the question of moral behavior? Well, you saw a number of examples of this in the reading that we did for today. One kind of question that moral theories set out to provide answers to is the question of whether it's either morally required or morally permitted to harm one person in order to help many others. So Bernard Williams' story of Jim and the Indians, where Jim is presented with a case where he's willing to shoot one of 20 prisoners The other 19 will be set free, whereas
nice.
if he's unwilling to shoot that one, all 20 of them will be shot.
Then shoot
Or the
him.
Omelas story, where we're told the story of a society whose flourishing depends upon the suffering of a single child.
Nice.
Or the trolley
Let the
cases
child
that I
cry.
presented you with in the very first lecture,
Push the
where
fat
a
man.
trolley is headed down a track towards 5 people,
Yes.
and we're in a position to deflect the trolley in
Yes,
some
deflect.
way so that one ends up being killed instead.
Good.
Those are examples of schematic representations of the kinds of questions that moral theory confronts all
Yeah.
the time.
Conclusions are
Whenever
already
we
available.
think about deferrals of threat, is it right to quarantine a population suffering from a particular illness in a way that will cause harm to them but benefit
Yes.
the rest of society?
Yes.
We are thinking about these sorts of questions. So one sort of question that moral philosophy aims to answer is the question of whether this sort of trade-off is morally required or morally permitted.
Within
A
reason,
particularly
yes.
profound version of that question comes out
Okay.
when we think about what our moral duties are to those who are less fortunate. So the philosopher Peter Singer has famously argued that the entire structure of the first world and the third world is a morally illegitimate one because it involves an unwillingness on the part of those in the first world to do what is morally demanded of them, namely to take a large
कौन है ला? ताल.
proportion of their
Bye.
resources and redistribute those to the world to do what is morally demanded of them, namely to take a large proportion of their resources
Okay.
and redistribute those to people who
Sorry,
involve the
did people-
entire structure of the first world and the third world is a morally illegitimate one because it involves an unwillingness on the part of those in the first world to do what is morally demanded of them, namely to take a large proportion of their resources
Yes.
and redistribute those to people who are suffering from extraordinarily easily curable illnesses. People
Yes.
who don't have mosquito nets, people who don't have vaccinations, people who don't have clean water, people who
Okay.
don't have access to basic medical care in the first 5 years that would, for example, prevent
Okay.
lifelong blindness. So another question that moral theory asks, in some ways a version of the earlier question, is in general what our duties are to those who are less fortunate.
None.
It also
No,
asks
there are
questions
a lot
like
of
this.
duties,
Are these
not
sorts
none.
of behaviors morally mandatory? Is it morally
And being-
mandatory for us to behave in ways that help the environment, say by recycling? Is it
True.
morally mandatory for us to act in certain ways towards non-human animals?
maybe not
Perhaps
mandatory.
by being vegetarian. Is it morally required of us to
No,
worship a
there's
deity
no need to
in
be
some way?
vegetarian.
Is religious worship something that's morally mandatory?
No.
Is something like respect for elders a fundamental part
No.
of traditional moral frameworks morally
No.
mandatory? And moral theories also ask questions like, are these kinds of things morally permissible? Is abortion morally permissible? Is euthanasia
is
morally
imposing
permissible?
morality
Is
even
capital
morally
punishment
permissible?
morally permissible? How about
Okay.
sex before marriage? How about lying for one or another motivation? How about, as Kant's going to argue in our next reading, failing to cultivate one's talents, which Kant thinks is a violation
Is morality
of moral
morally
mandates.
permissible?
So these are the kinds of questions
Imposing
that moral
morality?
theories aim to provide answers to. And it might seem like a heterogeneous bunch, but it gives you a sense of the generality of explanation that moral theories seek to provide.
What
so
is that?
let's turn to 4 major moral theories in the Western tradition and think about how it is that they could simply categorically provide answers to this wide range of questions.
Okay.
So the kind of moral theory that we're going to discuss in today's lecture primarily is a moral theory known as utilitarianism.
Let's
It tells us an act is
go.
moral insofar as it produces the greatest good for the greatest number. It takes as its fundamental notion the notion of good, and it gives us answers to the questions that we've previously asked ourselves, as long
Uh, uh, okay. Let me go over my notes before because we are obviously switching segments into utilitarianism. So, moral philosophy, she didn't give any studies. So, what am I supposed to do? She just cited a bunch of, you know, stories, previously told stories. And, yeah. Be moral because why be moral? How to be moral? Be moral. Okay. Why be moral? Um, too much. Go back. Yes. Why be moral? Self-interest, altruism, just because. Why self-interest in brackets? Okay. Altruism, just because. No, this is not an altruism argument, is it? I'm so stupid. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Please don't hit me. Why did I say that? Altruism. Oh. Mm, okay, I should probably bracket these, right? Being moral is normal. Both planet Earth are normal. Yeah, and want die. Oh my god. It's so hard working with my keyboard when my mic is just right there. Okay, being moral is normal. Both planet Earth and human society are normal and want you to be normal. Altruism. Morality equals good. I know what altruism means now. So, is the altruistic argument that morality is just good? That's why do be moral. It shouldn't be just that, right? It's a bad argument, or is it a good argument? I don't know. Being moral is normal. Self-interest. God, out. Being moral is normal. Uh, to be. Okay. Why? Why is YouTube so bad? Why is YouTube so bad? It won't play the next song unless I play. Why? 100. One expanded. Yes, play. Just because. Altruism, what is the altruistic argument for morality? Argument. What does that even mean? Um, Behavior is okay. Get rid of this. Behavior is normally described as altruistic when it is motivated by a desire to benefit someone other than. Yeah, that I understood, but how? What is. The word is used more broad. Okay. Malicious designates an even greater contrast. It applies to behavior that expresses a desire to harm others simply for the sake of harming them. Sometimes, however, the word is used more broadly to refer to behavior that benefits others, regardless of its motive. Altruism, in its broad sense, might be attributed. Okay, what? Why am I? Why? Mixed, self sacrifice, strong, moral motives, and altruistic motives. Okay. Okay, so this is the segment, right? Some of what we do in our interactions with other people is morally motivated but not altruistic. Similarly, as these examples indicate, the notion of altruism is applicable to every morally motivated treatment of others, but more narrowly to what is done out of concern for the good of others. Morality equals good to others, good to other people. Other good to other people. That's it. If A was extra, okay, good of others. In other words, for their well-being. Altruistic acts might be described as charitable or benevolent or kind, for these words also convey the idea of acting for the good of others and not rightly or not merely rightly towards others. What? Often, the individuals who are targets of altruistic behavior are selected for such treatment because of a personal tie between benefactor and beneficiary. If A was extraordinarily kind to B and B was a child, and at a later time B is in position to help A out of a difficult situation, the help B gives to A is altruistically motivated, even though they're common past. So it's just morality because being moral is good. That's it. It's just that. Moral equals moral. Moral equals good to other people, bad to yourself. I still. What am I supposed to write here? Like, there is no altruistic argument. It's just that morality equals whatever. It's a judgment. That's it. Here's my judgment. Hold it. Now bye. Okay. Bye. What am I supposed to do? Moral is I think morality equals good is the only thing that altruism argues for. I don't think my initial framing of that
As long as we know how goods are distributed
Was,
in response to them. So if we know what it is that produces happiness in sentient beings, then utilitarianism will give us an answer to the question of whether being vegetarian is morally mandated. It'll tell us to take the amount of happiness that's distributed across sentient beings and look at which distribution is going to maximize the amount of happiness. So utilitarianism gives us one sort of systematic answer to this question. A second sort of answer to this question, which we'll discuss in lecture on Tuesday, is the answer given by Kant and the deontological tradition. What Kant says is that an act is moral insofar as it's performed as the result of acting with the correct sort of motivation. It takes as its primary notion not the notion of goodness, but rather the notion of rightness. And on that basis, Kant is going to give a bunch of answers to our specific questions. In particular, he's going to argue that it's not okay to sacrifice the good of the one for the good of the many. And he's going to argue that lying is morally unacceptable. And we'll talk next class about how, from a very abstract principle like this one can derive these sorts of particular answers. We've already looked at the ancient traditional answer to this in Aristotle, that an act is moral insofar as it's performed as the result of having a virtuous character. And so what Aristotle says to us is, look and see how the well-raised one would behave. And once you see what it is that the virtuous one does, you can learn through his or her example what it is that morality demands of us. And a final tradition about which we won't have much to say in this lecture is, of course, a basis for morality which has stood at the center of Western culture for at least 2,000 years, which is the idea that an act is moral insofar as it conforms to what the divinity demands of us. So one can provide an explanation, as utilitarian does, that makes appeal to the notion of goodness. One can provide a justification that makes appeal, as deontology does, to the notion of rightness. One can provide a justification that makes appeal, as virtue ethics does, to the notion of virtuousness. Or one can provide an account that makes appeal, as religious ethics does, to the notion of divine mandate. So let's think a little more about the relation among these three particular theories, the ones on which we're going to focus in the context of this class, as a way of coming to understand the particular theory that we're thinking about today, namely utilitarianism. So virtue ethics focuses its attention on the actor, not the person who stands up on the stage and recites lines from Hamlet, but rather the actor who performs an act that will be moral or not. Deontology focuses its attention on the act. It looks not at who's doing it, but rather at what act is done and under what description. Consequentialism, by contrast, looks not at who does the act and looks not at the description under which the act is done, but looks rather at the consequences that the act brings about. And we've encountered virtue theory in the voice of, see if you recognize this gentleman, in the voice of Aristotle. We will encounter deontology in the voice of Immanuel Kant. And what we're going to discuss today is consequentialism and in particular utilitarianism in the voice of John Stuart Mill. So let's look now at what it is that Mill has to say about the fundamental nature of morality.
Okay.
So what Mill contends, and let me say we're coming up on the clicker slide, so if you're zoning out, it's time to pull out your clicker, and in about 4 or 5 minutes we'll be doing some polls.
Okay, nice.
So Mill contends that the right kind of framework for thinking about moral theories is a consequentialist framework. So not one that looks at the actor as virtue theory does, not one that looks at the act as deontology does.
Okay, so utilitarianism is just consequentialism. Is utilitarianism a branch of consequentialism? Consequentialism and utilitarianism. Who is the daddy? Who's the head boy? Tell me. Okay. Consequentialism. Classic utilitarianism is consequentialism. Consequentialism. What is consequentialism? Okay. Check this out. Let's get rid of this. And let's turn up the music just a bit. And let's put on some good music instead of this piano and whatever trash. Okay. Just quiet down just a bit. Consequentialism. Oh no, she's gonna start singing and she has a good voice. I don't want to destroy that. Bad vibe. No.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
No. Okay, this is a chill theme. Consequentialism, as its name suggests, is simply the view that normative properties depend only on consequences. This historically important and still popular theory embodies the basic intuition that what is best or right is whatever makes the world best in the future. Because we cannot change the past, so worrying about the past is no more useful than crying over spilt milk. This general approach can be applied at different levels to different normative properties of different kinds of things, but most prominent example is probably consequentialism about the moral rightness of acts, which holds that whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences. You're repeating yourself, what? Okay? Or of something related to the act. Okay. Such as the motive behind they're not repeating, they're specifying. Okay. Such as the motive behind the act or a general rule requiring acts of the same kind. Okay. The paradigm case is utilitarianism, whose classic properties were John Stuart Mill. Yeah, okay. So utilitarianism is like a branch of consequentialism, right? Or is modern consequentialism something else? Consequentialism equals, okay, so this is good. Whether an act is morally right or consequence, yeah, okay. Actual consequentialism, whether an act is morally right, depends on the actual consequences as opposed to foreseen, foreseeable, intended, or likely. Okay, so this is just gaslighting. Okay, direct consequentialism, whether an act is morally right, depends only on the consequences of that act itself, as opposed to the consequences of the agent's motive or rule. Okay, makes sense. Aggregate, total, universal consequentialism agents. Since classic utilitarianism reduces all morally relevant factors to consequences, it might appear simple. However, classic utilitarianism is a complex combination of, okay, all of these. Moral rightness only depends on the value of the consequences. Evaluative consequentialism. Okay. Okay, I got it. Boner for consequentialism. This is bad. Huge hard on for consequentialism.
Sound right, boys.
A link that if it's like relevant to the, yeah, let's just continue.
But
Yeah,
rather one
halfway.
that looks at the consequences in the way that consequentialism does. The degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, and Mill provides a particular version of this. He says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by a particular kind of consequence, namely the utility that the act produces. So you might have a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, namely, for example, the amount of bananas that it produces.
Okay. So we are just going to divorce all of that we just read and go back to Mill. Introduction to utilitarianism. Let me skip ahead and see what she's arguing for. Back. Please, Ron. Hello. Hi. Are you working?
Is determined by a particular kind of consequence, namely the utility that the act produces. So you
Very
might
well.
have a consequentialist theory that says the degree of greatest
Okay.
happiness principle. Lake?
Greatest happiness principle.
It sound right, boy.
Actions are right, okay. Mill's utilitarianism, saving someone from drowning, the happiness. Okay. Okay, I get it. She's just going over utilitarianism. Omela's story, whatever that is. That's ahead. Okay, this is going to be interesting. We are purely going by one guy. And that's going to make things much simpler. Mill is like
About
the founder,
fundamental
right?
nature of
Right here?
morality.
Yeah, Mill.
So what
This
Mill
Jeremy
contends,
guy
and
did
let
it
me say,
before
we're
him, but
coming up on
he
the clicker
died,
slide,
and
so if
nobody
you're
cares,
zoning
I
out,
guess.
it's time to pull out your clicker, and in
Okay,
about
nice.
4 or 5 minutes, we'll be doing some polls. So Mill
Nice.
contends that the right kind of framework for thinking about moral theories is a consequentialist framework. So not one that looks
Okay.
at the actor as virtue theory does, not one that looks at the act as deontology does, but rather one that looks at the consequences in the way that consequentialism does. The degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, and Mill provides a particular version of this. He says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by a particular kind of consequence, namely the utility that the act produces. So you might have a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, namely, for example, the amount of bananas that it produces. It would be an odd moral theory, but it would be a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, in particular by its degree of banana production. So that would...
Okay, the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by the utility it produces. Determined by the consequences, okay? Utilitarian consequences.
Consequentialism does. Pull out your clicker, and in about 4 or 5 minutes, we'll be
Get
doing some
rid
polls.
of this music.
So Mill
Cringe.
contends that the right kind of framework for thinking about moral theories is a consequentialist framework. So not one that looks at the actor as virtue theory does, not one that looks at the act as deontology does, but rather one that looks at the consequences in the way that consequentialism does. The degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, and Mill provides a particular version of this. He says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by a particular kind of consequence, namely the utility that the act produces. So you might have a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, namely, for example, the amount of bananas that it produces. It would be an odd moral theory, but it would be a consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, in particular by its degree of banana production. So that would be a very general kind of consequentialist theory. Utilitarian theories are a particular kind of consequentialist theory that says the degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by its consequences, in particular by the amount of utility, usefulness, happiness in Mill's account of what kind of utility we're concerned with, by the amount of utility that it produces. That means, to remind you of the handouts that you got in section this week, that to be utilitarian is a sufficient condition to be a consequentialist, but not a necessary one.
Okay.
Section this week, that to be utilitarian is a sufficient condition to be a consequentialist, but not a necessary one. And to be a consequentialist is a necessary condition on being a utilitarian, but not a sufficient one.
Okay. What is she saying? I'm just zoning out. Please help. Okay. Back. Mill's utilitarianism. Okay. The degree of moral rightness of an act is determined by the utility it produces. So, huge hard-on for the degree of utility of a consequence. Huge. Okay.
And if what I'm very usefulness, happiness in Mill's account of what kind of utility we're concerned with, by the amount of utility that it produces. That means, to remind you of the handouts that you got in section this week, that to be utilitarian is a sufficient condition to be a consequentialist, but not a necessary one. And to be a consequentialist is a necessary condition on being a utilitarian, but not a sufficient one.
Okay.
And if what
Makes
I
sense.
just said isn't completely obvious to you, take a look at the second side of the handout that you got in section this week.
I didn't get anything.
So Mill not only makes a utilitarian commitment, he actually, in the course of making that commitment, makes two very particular claims that I now want to ask you to think about in light of some particular cases. The first is the famous formulation of the greatest happiness principle, which in your text appears right at the beginning on page 77 in the reprint. Mill says famously, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to promote the reverse of happiness. And he continues a few pages later to clarify that what he means is not the agent's own happiness,
5.2.
but that of all concerned.
Okay. Actions are right in proportion as to they tend to promote happiness. Wrong as they, okay, greatest happiness principle. Wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. What a twister. Okay. Kinda seems nonsensical. Happiness is when happiness. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Reverse of happiness. Not the agent's own happiness, but that of all concerned. Okay, so it's also an altruistic thing, right? So it has an aspect of altruism, but with much more militancy, I guess. Altruism may just be utilitarianism in some sense. Okay, let's just go.
In a minute, we'll think through what that implies. The second commitment of Mill's that I want you to think about is one that runs straight on in opposition to what we talked about in Aristotle last week. Mill says, the motive has nothing to do with the morality of the action. He who saves another creature from drowning does what is morally right, whether his motive be duty or the hope of being paid for his trouble. The motivation with which an act is performed, says Mill, tells us nothing about the morality of the act. He doesn't deny that it tells us something about the actor. He's perfectly happy to say that somebody who does the act out of the hope of being paid is in some way different from the person who does the act out of a sense of duty or moral obligation. But as far as the moral value of the act itself is concerned,
Altruism. Greatest happiness principle. Let me. Motive does not matter. So I don't know. Motive does not matter. Only consequences.
Mill thinks there is no difference. So that's the first question that I want to ask you. Take the case that Mill's described. You see somebody drowning in a lake, and the question is this: is your act of saving that person morally right, morally virtuous, moral, only if it's done out of duty? I want to save that person because it's the right thing to do, or some other sort of pro-social motive. If you think that, push 1. Or is the act morally right regardless of its motive, even if you do it because there's a big sign up on the trees that say, save a drowning person,
more people are going to get saved if you don't gatekeep saving people, right?
Jump into the water. All right,
yeah, don't gatekeep saving drowning people, right?
We have roughly 50 of you, 70 of you. Good, numbers are jumping up. Let's just see whether instinctively this room is filled with Kantians or filled with consequentialists. So interestingly, there's a pretty close to even split. Most of you seem to side with Mill on the question that an act is morally right regardless of the motive. But a sizable portion of you are going to be pleased when we read Kant, who gives the answer that you offer. And one of the things that we want to do in section next week is to have those of you who fall on one or the other side of this question talk through with others around you why it is that you either fell into this group or you fell into this one. So far, Mill's doing pretty well. He has a slight majority of you on his side.
Nice.
I now want to present you with a series of cases to ask what you think about the greatest happiness principle. Remember, Mill says that an act is moral insofar as it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, where we're not concerned with how that happiness is distributed across individuals. So let's start with a following case. There's an act which you can perform which will give you 100 units of happiness. Each of those colorful smiley faces, aren't you all feeling pro-social in their light? Each of those smiley faces represents 10 units of happiness. So suppose you have a fan, it's a very hot day, and you have a fan that blows upon you, and the coolness of that fan just provides you with 100 units of happiness. Or suppose you have some delicious cookies, and eating those cookies provides you with 100 units of happiness. In addition, performing that act provides 100 other people with 1 unit of happiness each. Suppose your fan blows a little bit outside of your room so that in addition to cooling you off 100 units, it cools the people in the next room off 1 unit apiece. Or suppose that when you finish eating your 100 cookies, there are 100 cookies left over, and each of 100 people gets to have 1 cookie, and it brings them 1 unit
200
of happiness.
If you give out.
So that's Act 1. It has a total of 200 units of happiness. You get 100 units, and each of 100 other people get 1 unit.
Nice.
So
Everybody's
your choice
happy.
is between performing that act and performing an act which I'm going to call Act 2, which has exactly the same effects for you, right? It brings you 100 units of happiness. So here you are with your 100 units of happiness. But in this case, if you made a slight change in the angle of your fan, for example, you would be just as cool as you were in the first case, but it would double the amount of happiness of the people on the outside, right? You angle the fan slightly differently, and instead of being cooled 1 unit, the people are cooled 2 units. Or
so more happiness,
instead of throwing out your trash at the end of eating your cookies so that people only get 1 unit of happiness, you leave the extra cookies around so that everybody else gets 2 units of happiness. In this case, by performing an act which has no different consequences for you as far as happiness is concerned, you double the happiness of 100 other people with respect to the act. So the question is simply this. Given the choice between Act 1, which brings a total of 200 units of happiness, 100 units for you, and 1 unit for each of 100 other people, or Act 2, which brings the same amount of happiness to you, but 200 units of happiness to others, and hence a total of 300. Do you think, push 1 if you think only Act 1 is moral, that is, only the one where you get 100 units and everybody else gets 1. Push 2 if you think only Act 2 is moral, the one where you redirect your fan slightly or whatever it is that you do to double the happiness of those around you. Or 3, that either one of those is a moral act. Okay? And I'm going to turn our timer on so that we have 10 seconds to see how it is that your first take on Mill's greatest happiness
Why are you gatekeeping someone from doing a good thing
the numbers come out.
and sharing happiness?
Okay, so very few of you think that the moral act is the one whereby you get 100 units of happiness.
Oh, those 2% of people are gigachats.
But you're roughly equally divided on the question of whether morality mandates that you redistribute your resources in such a way that they go also to others. So most of our discussion in the remaining slides will be concerned with when this 44% moves over to another place.
Makes sense.
But I'll be interested to see how all of this plays out.
Nice.
So that was our first case, the case where at no cost to yourself, you can bring happiness to